Good afternoon and welcome to today's lunch break with the Rabbi. Today is Wednesday. Today is Tuesday. Getting the days all mixed up here. Okay, today is Tuesday, December 15th. We continue. Today is the fifth day of Hanukkah, as we're going to continue our discussion about the oil and the miracle of Hanukkah and our Hanukkah discussion during the 8 days of Hanukkah, as we spoke about and continue to talk about the miracles that happened on Hanukkah. So today is, as we mentioned, the fifth day of Hanukkah. And as we discussed yesterday about the miracles of the oil and the happenings around the story of Hanukkah, today we continue our discussion. There was once this rabbi who was making a beautiful spread of a Hanukkah party, but he was also a great antique enthusiast who had the most unique collection of Hanukkah menorahs. And he took all these beautiful Hanukkah menorahs and put them on display. And as the community gathered together, and he starts going through all the different Hanukkah menorahs that he has on his table and showing them the uniqueness and where they're from. This one's 200 years old. That one's 100 years old. That one's from the Spanish Inquisition. That was from the Auschwitz, and all those different unique antiques that he had there. Finally, one fellow raised his hand and said, Rabbi, and what about the donuts? How old are they? We talk about the miracle of Hanukkah, and we focus a lot about the oil that happened during the miracle of Hanukkah. Because of that, we have fried food, we have latkes, we have donuts, and all different kind of fried items to remember and commemorate the miracle of Hanukkah. What is so unique about the miracle of the oil, as we discussed? It was that the Jewish people were able to finally light the menorah after finding that little one jug of flask of oil. And the miraculous events that happened around it was the very fact that they were able to ignite something which was seemingly only there for one day or enough for one night and use it for 8 nights. But over here comes the intriguing question. A question that's been asked by Talmudic commentators already hundreds of years ago, which is that we know that God does not make a miracle for no reason. We know that our God is not here just to show off his strength and say, look how great I am, I can make so many great miracles. But every time God makes a miracle, there's a purpose, there's a reason, there's a lesson, and there's an ultimate teaching that comes from it. What is the lesson that can come from the fact that God would make a miracle that the oil should light for 8 days? There's a well-known halachic adage that if everybody is impure and the entire community is impure, there's no need to find pure olive oil to light the menorah. You're allowed to light the menorah with impure olive oil. There's no need to make that special miracle. That means the Jewish people at that time, even though they only found impure olive oil, technically, legally, halachically, they were able to light the menorah without any problems. There was no need for a miracle. Why was it that God should have to make this miracle and make this unbelievable event to the extent that we're still celebrating it today about the miracle of the oil, when technically speaking, it was not unnecessary? So let's go back a little bit and look at the story of Hanukkah, of what really happened, and look at the history of the story of Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah takes us back over 2,200 years ago, during the time in the era of the Second Temple, where Israel at the time was under foreign jurisdiction. There were the Persians, the Babylonians, and now the Greeks, who were then conquering all of Syria, and all of a sudden decided, at that time they had no problem, I should say, with the Jewish people's practices. But all of a sudden, King Antiochus IV, who decided that he wants to extend his kingdom, and he was afraid of people rebelling, and he decided that the only way he can assure that people don't rebel against him was by making sure that they don't practice any religion, and they were all basically atheists. And therefore, he demanded that they become Messiavnim, they become Greeks. And he was very into showing off the physique, the materialism of the individual, forgetting all the spirituality. He was the first that invented the concept of the Olympia, showing that the Olympia, which is the strength of the idol, of the gods, of the physical nature of the human being, the physique of the individual. And for that reason, Antiochus created gymnasiums and put up statues of half-naked people, for that reason, to show off the physical strength of the individual, which was something which he promoted very much so. And because of that, Antiochus and his efforts to be able to convince and to get the Jews to assimilate, he put all over Jerusalem gymnasiums, statues, and trying to get the Jewish people to assimilate and become like Greeks. And he was essentially successful to a certain extent. Even the great high priest, Yochanan Kohen Gadol's brother, changed his name from Yeshua to Yuzam, which was a Greek name, and appointed himself the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, as in place for Antiochus. And the Greeks were going and spreading their jurisdiction throughout the places of the land of Israel and enforcing the Jewish people not to observe the major commandments as circumcision, Shabbos, festivals, and children should not be allowed to study Torah. They had no problem with adults studying only the intellectual parts of Torah, but not the children. They felt it was, so to speak, brainwashing. Let them be atheists. Why should they study anything of the Torah? However, under a small little, in the mountains between Jerusalem and Modi'in, was a small family. A family led by their father, Mattityahu, and his 5 sons. And his son, Judah the Maccabee, who was the one that led a guerrilla warfare against the Greeks. And this guerrilla warfare lasted for about 4 years. And every single one of these guerrilla warfares was met with another victory and another victory. And here's just a little side point story. I think it's just an amazing story to see how they were successful in waging off against the Maccabees. The Maccabees against the Greeks. The Maccabees were a small army. We're talking about a few families, and eventually they grew a little more. And these were thousands of Greeks, a superpower. There were 50,000 Greek soldiers just in the outskirts of Jerusalem. And what they did was, once, there was one of the greatest victories that they had, but they went to the mountaintop of Jerusalem and they lit a massive fire. The Greeks believed that the guerrillas were there, the Hashemona and the Maccabees were there, so they sent a troop of 5,000 Greek soldiers to go attack the guerrillas that were on top of the mountain because they saw the fire in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army, about 30,000 of them, were down on the bottom sleeping, not worried because they said, who can touch us? They're all the way up there on the mountain. While the 5,000 went to the top of the mountain, the Maccabees went to the bottom of the mountain to the rest of the camp of the Greeks, ambushed them, set them ablaze, burnt them all, and got rid of 30,000 Greeks in one shot. When the 5,000 from the top of the mountain came down and they saw the entire camp up in flames, they ran for their life, and that was the beginning of the end of the Greeks. And so on and so forth. As history tells us, there's the Megillus Antiochus of how they continuously were coming after the one battalion of soldiers, another battalion of soldiers, until eventually, after 4 years, they were able to rid the Greeks of anywhere around Jerusalem, and they were able to come back into the Holy Temple and light the menorah and clean the place up. One of the reasons why we have actually 8 days of Hanukkah, according to some commentaries, was because there are 7 days of quarantine. I'm sure we're familiar with that these days. 7 days of quarantine for a person who is impure. And during those 7 days of impurity, they were not allowed to produce the new olive oil, and only until they were able to get the new olive oil, so it took 8 days. But over here, we're back to our original question. If they were all impure, because they did this beautiful fight, and they were able to conquer the Greek army, we celebrate the fight, we celebrate the fact that the few were able to overcome the many, but why the miracle of the oil? What was the need of the miracle? We saw it was an unbelievable miracle. So we all know what a miracle means. We all know when something happens with ease. We all know that what nature sometimes needs that we should work hard, and at times things miraculously open up for us. And over here we see something very unique in the time of the miracle of the Maccabees, which is that the Maccabees at the time realized that the waging of the war of the Greeks was not just against the Jews. In fact, they allowed the Jews to assimilate and become Greeks. They would love for the Jews to become Greeks. But the war was against, as we say in V'alanisim, la'ashkicham teirasecha, to make them forget their Torah. It wasn't just a military victory that they were celebrating. That we have Passover, there, Purim, the many other ones. But Hanukkah is unique. Hanukkah is unique in the fact that what had happened over here was that the Maccabees did not have to wage war against the Greeks. They could have stayed settled in their own little cocoon in Modi'in and not fight against the Greeks or assimilate them. Even if they don't assimilate, they could observe the commandments. Nobody find them in their caves. But they decided that Judaism, not necessarily Jews, Judaism was about to be destroyed. Judaism, the way we know it, was not going to be able to be around because the Greeks were against any practice of Judaism. And they decided that we are going to go all out, go beyond what was called on us, even beyond what the Torah calls on us, to be able to wage war against the Greeks. Because according to Judaism, you only have to give your life if your life is threatened. But it doesn't say you have to wage war. But they went and waged war against the Greeks to save Judaism. What does God do? God pays back in kind. God says, look here, you guys went the extra mile. I go the extra mile too. They say a story once about the previous Rebbe was on one of his trips in Moscow during the time when communism, right after World War I, and he was sitting with another wealthy individual, and they were discussing communal matters, and all of a sudden a fellow runs in and says, Rabbi, fellas, Jews, there's a girl here that's being taken by the priest, and he's forcing conversion on her to Christianity. The only way he's going to let this girl go is if we pick up a 10,000 ruble. The previous Rebbe takes money out of his pocket. The fellow that he's with takes money out of his pocket. And the guy goes. The next day, the previous Rebbe meets this fellow, and he says, so what happened in the end? He says, listen, I didn't get all the money I needed. I went home, took the jewelry that I have, I pawned it, and I was able to get enough money to save the girl. The previous Rebbe was amazed that when he came home, he told his father, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, about the story. The fifth Chabad Rebbe tells the previous Rebbe, God doesn't stay in debt. God always repays his debt. That was the only statement he said. A year later, the previous Rebbe was back in Moscow, and he sees this big, beautiful bank, walks inside, and guess who is the banker, the owner of this bank, and very wealthy individual, was this fellow that pawned his jewelry to save that Jewish girl. The same idea is over here as well. God showed the Maccabees, that God does not stay in debt. God will always repay his debt. The same way the Maccabees went beyond the letter of the law, and they went and fought for Judaism even though it was not required by the law, so too God made a miracle that though not required by law, was there that the oil should last for 8 days. Take it even a step further. Hanukkah is the only festival that every single Jew in every household you know celebrates the most precious way, the best way. You know, every single mitzvah you can do a little bit, and just fulfill your obligation, or you can go all out. You can get a small esrig, or you can get a fancy one. Hanukkah, the minimal obligation is one candle. That's it, every night. But you know a house that only does one candle? Everybody lights 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. That's because God repaid the Maccabees and said, guys, you went all out. The mitzvah, every Jew is going to go all out for you. You went all out. I'll make a miracle that symbolizes the many over the few. Just like you few were able to overcome the many, so too this little bit of oil that can only last one night will last 8 nights, will be a miracle of monumental proportion, that for now on, what they're going to celebrate is the oil symbolizing the fact going beyond the letter of the law. The lesson is clear from the story of Hanukkah. God reminds every single one of us the way we can overcome our obstacles, the way we stand up against any obstacles or trials and tribulations in our life, is that we need to go beyond the letter of the law. Don't wait to be called upon. Stand up and celebrate. God will always repay. God never stays in debt. God knows that if you will do your best, he will do his best, and miracles do happen. God bless you. Wait and see the miracles in your life. When you go on beyond the letter of the law, God does it too. All the best. Wishing you a happy Hanukkah and looking forward to celebrating with you tomorrow at 1 p.m. God bless and have a great day. Happy Hanukkah.